You're listening to the opening track of Streets of Rage 2. Arguably one of the greatest 16-bit beat-em-ups ever made, this was the first title that made me a believer in the Sega Genesis. Before then, I was in last week's Bit Wars, a corporal in the SNES army. Until I got my hands on Streets of Rage 2, I considered the Genesis to be the lesser system, a console I would never need to consider, never mind own. Boy, was I wrong. While I'm no expert on the Genesis, or Mega Drive as it's known outside of North America, I've met dozens of people over the years who are. And in doing this next series of episodes, I learned a ton about this incredible console and the low-key classics that call it home. On this week's edition of A Gamer Looks at 40, we look at the Sega Genesis, the system, the games, and the lasting impact it had on gamers everywhere. Slap a cart into the game slot and push the system's headphone volume up to 10 because we're taking a tour of the Sega Genesis. Andrew Craig, who you may remember from the Legend of Zelda episode, starts us off with his recollections of the Sega Genesis. Based on the notes that you gave me, you were more Genesis than SNES.
For the beginning of the generation, yeah.
Right.
I didn't get an SNES until they released it as a bundle with Donkey Kong Country.
Oh yeah, I remember that bundle.
I mean, that should be a good indication of where it was, because that game is like end of the generation stuff right there.
Super late, yeah.
I got pulled in because Sonic, like the advertising worked on me.
Nice.
Like, you know, the Genesis does what Nintendo don't thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Absolutely worked. The idea of this, the FM sound chip and just the fast speeds and the bright colors and all that. And so we had a deal worked out where I had a Sega Genesis and one of my friends got a Super Nintendo. And just by the nature of how it worked out, he was over at my house a lot more than I was at his. So I didn't get to experience a lot of the SNES stuff until way later.
Interesting. And I will say, for the record, that although back in those days I was heavily involved in the Bit Wars, I was heavily involved in. I was very Team Nintendo.
We were all soldiers. We just didn't necessarily choose our side.
Exactly. The side chose, our parents chose it by buying us whatever console, and we had to defend it to the death. No, I was Team Nintendo, and I will always say that the Genesis sound chips do sound miles better, I think.
Well, when they're used correctly,
Sure.
They sound better. If they're not, they sound like just... They sound like somebody humming into an aluminum can.
That's a very good way of putting it. When it comes to chiptune stuff, I do have a fondness for the Genesis like soundtracks, the way they sound, that kind of crisper. The Super Nintendo is always kind of, they tried to be more. What's the word I'm looking?
It's rounder.
It's rounder.
It's a rounder sound.
Yes,
where the Sega was very kind of hard rock edge. Aggression.
Yeah.
And the Super Nintendo is always very soft and round and
yeah, no, it's a great way of putting
everything
it
that makes them great.
Next up, George, also known as G to the Next Level on Twitter and on YouTube and on Twitch, shares why he caught the Genesis bug.
It was 1991 and a certain blue hedgehog came around back around that time, and I just immediately just grew full attention to Sonic. I was like, I love everything about this. And sure enough, we got a Genesis in Christmas 1991. My dad got the system with the Altered Beast pack-in, Sonic the Hedgehog, Outrun, and Honorable Palmer's Tournament Golf, which is mainly for him. But he's a golfer.
Yeah.
So he still is a golfer. Cool. But yeah, and then it just kind of went from there. The Genesis really was the one that it was the system that hit me the hardest throughout my entire time. So much, in fact, that throughout my years afterwards, going into high school and the college and whatnot, it was the one system that I never really sold any games for. And then sure enough, future down the path, that's when I started becoming a collector when it came to like retro games and whatnot, especially during right after my college years. I thought to myself, well, you know what? I want to go for a full collection when it comes with the Sega Genesis. And I did. Like throughout the years, I just did little by little. It wasn't something that just came all of a sudden, all right, I'm just going to go off and go buy every single Genesis game I possibly can to get in my collection. No, it was one that just kind of came a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. A lot of it came from working at Funkoland, now known as GameStop. When their games clearanced out for like literally dollars, like complete in-box copies of Genesis games, like games that go for insane amounts now, like Splatterhouse 3 and so many other games that I got directly from them. And then just sure enough, a couple of years ago, I completed it. And I got Dune the Battle for Arrakis, aka Dune 2. That was the last Genesis game that I needed for my retail collection.
So you have you have every game.
Well, almost. I say retail.
Oh, retail, okay.
Every retail one, because there are a few that were mail orders that some people will want to count to a Genesis set, mainly Outback Joey, the NHLPA Heartbeat Monitor games, because they require a special Genesis in order for you to play it. So I personally don't count them. I know some people do.
Not to kind of just not to stop the brakes, but what is an NHLPA heart rate monitor? What is this thing? I've never heard of this. So
there was a company that actually made an exercise bike that hooked up to a special edition of the Genesis called the Heartbeat. It was a Heartbeat, a special version of the Genesis console. You had to have that specific console in order to play it. But there was one other game that was made specifically for that, and then Outback Joey, which was a game about obviously a kangaroo. Then it was made to help you exercise, but it was only available by mail order. It is super, super incredibly rare. We're talking like thousands and thousands of dollars that this game is worth it for a game that you have to have a special console to play. So
wow,
I'll stick with my Activator. Okay, thanks.
Right. And so you feel like was it the fact that you had so much Sega in the arcades? It was very prevalent there with your Hang On and everything else. Was that what you felt drew you to the consoles?
I believe so.
That connection?
I believe so. I mean, not just for me, but also for my dad as well. Because like we would play those games together too. Like when he wasn't bowling, we would play those games together too. So when I said that I wanted, hey, can I get a Sega Genesis? And it was mainly about Sonic. He was also familiar with those other games from the arcade. He's like, hey, I know Outrun.
Oh, that's cool.
Like, I know those games. So it's like, hey, it's games I can play with you.
There was no Mario in the, well, there was, I guess there was Mario in the arcade, but not quite like, not like, again, Outrun or Hang On or anything like that. Next up, Jeremy, also known as Ducks in Disguise on Twitter, and then Justin from Baseball and Whatever podcast, share their first impressions with the Genesis, as well as getting used to it. Going from 2 buttons to 3 isn't as easy as it sounds. So let's kind of move forward a bit to the 16-bit era. Were you a SNES kid or a Genesis kid?
We started with the Genesis, actually.
Okay.
So after the NES, the family got a Genesis, and I did not know what to do with this new console. Coming from the NES to the Genesis, it was just such a visual leap. The controller was shaped all different. It had an extra button on it. And Sonic was just so fast. I mean, that sounds kind of silly, but if you think about NES games and things like that, you really didn't see anything move that fast before.
No.
So when we got our hands on Sonic the Hedgehog, it was just like, wait a second, I need to play this and replay this and replay this so I can get better just with my reaction time.
That's funny, yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I loved my Genesis. There were so many great games on there. So of course the Sonic series, like I said, I was big on platformers, but I also really liked some of the more slower paced things. Like Toe Jam and Earl is really quirky and kind of cool. The humor there was great. I also liked Road Rash, which was the Road Rash series. That was something I'd never played up to that point either. Like, yeah, you play racing games or whatever, but combat racing, that's different.
That was pretty different for the era. Didn't it have a great soundtrack too, Road Rash?
It really did. It really fit the Genesis well too, because it was like a rock soundtrack, and the Genesis had that sound chip where everything came out kind of crunchy. So it really fit well.
No, that's Road Rash. Wow, that is a memory. Did you play a lot of Sonic on your Genesis?
Yes. Oh yeah. I still have the password or the cheat when the starting screen comes up, so you could load whatever level you wanted.
Nice.
I had Sonic 1. That music, I'm not a huge video game music person, except for, Final Fantasy VII is a soundtrack I'll still put on to this day just because I love that game and that music.
Yeah.
But Sonic, the Sonic series is another one. I'll hear some of the music on YouTube, or I think, honestly, I'll have to admit, I think I have a few Sonic ringtones just because I like the song so much. But that was another one, going from, Super Mario Brothers to Sonic was just a huge jump. And being able to move that fast on screen and all these different colors, and the sprites looked so much better. And, and then obviously, a jump like I remember when I still got my PS1, and then going to Crash Bandicoot as another platformer was another huge jump. But I still look back at, granted Sega's in a different spot nowadays in terms of their business model, but man, I loved that Genesis. I played the heck out of that thing. It was just a great console to have, and it had a little bit of everything, and it didn't have Mario to rely on, so I feel like they had to make some bigger leaps. Some were hits, and then obviously some were misses too, but it was a good time.
Yeah, man, definitely cool. I never had I'm the opposite because I never had a Sega system. During the Bit Wars, I was very much so Nintendo. I was a corporal in the Bit Wars, you see, and but man, that's cool. Sonic is another game I never had much experience with, which I liked hearing from people who had Genesis and had Sega back in those days because, it's a cool perspective. A perspective I don't have, so. Next up, Joe Corio talks a bit about the attitude of Sega and the attitude of Genesis, and why that differentiation from Nintendo, which was considered old and slow and stodgy, really excited him and made him want to be a part of that Genesis ecosystem. And the fact that he was a built-in Sega fan didn't hurt either. So let's move on to the 16-bit era. Now, again, as we've learned in episode 3, I think it was, you were a Sega kid on a Nintendo playground. What came first for you, the Genesis or the SNES?
The Genesis, the Genesis came. Yeah, I mean that was then the SNES, and then I start getting the peripherals for the Genesis, the 32X, the Sega CD. But the Genesis, there was nothing at the time that was like that. They were cool. They were edgy, and they marketed themselves as edgy. They had that same edginess to a teenager or a preteen. They were angry because the third party, that agreement that Nintendo had, that license with just them for third party software, that had ended by 90. So they were angry. They were pissed off, and they made no bones of attacking Nintendo, and that's what I gravitated to. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. That was cool. I mean, that was there was no one. You didn't even acknowledge the competition. Never mind openly attack them like they did, and they did. Their mascot was cool. Their mascot was edgy. Their mascot was fast. Mario was slow. Their games had blood.
Right.
Super Nintendo. So, that was in the beginning. I immediately gravitated to the Genesis, and plus I was so happy too, because I always thought the Master System was the better system, and it didn't even come close to NES. So I was like, yeah, all right, this is, let's run it back. This is Sega's time to shine.
Now that we've talked about the console, it's time to talk about the games. But before I get into the collections and all the different titles available for the Sega Genesis, there was one game in particular that nearly everybody I spoke to had to speak some sort of sugar upon. And no, it wasn't Sonic. And no, it wasn't Streets of Rage. And it wasn't Echo the Dolphin. It wasn't even Mortal Kombat. Every one of those games got their time, and you'll hear a bit about those later on in the episode. But there was one game in particular that I found astonishing, attracted everybody, and I mean nearly everybody, to this particular system. And it just so happens to be the coolest game on ice. was a lot of great games for that Genesis. Was there anyone in particular you played, just played to death? Like this was your, again, kind of your obsession game for the Genesis at least.
Yes. NHL 94. That was and that was, and it's funny too because that was available for everything. I mean, portables, SNES. That was available. Yeah, that was EA, right? So that was not exclusive to Genesis, Super Nintendo, or anything. But this was the 90s. This was the apex of hockey. Hockey was enormous in the 90s. I was a huge hockey fan. We were huge hockey fans. My father had season tickets. You came to most of those games, and and then this game came out, and it was tremendous. There had been really no hockey game up until that point, except Blades of Steel, which was done well, but no game at that point had that type of replay value, that type of speed. You could score. There were highlight reel saves. You could fight. You could knock the other person out. There'd be blood on the ice. There was real players that you were dealing with. So when you picked the Devils, you were playing as Richer. You were playing as Claude Lemieux. You had Scott Stevens and Scott Niedermayer, all these great players. And then the 2-player element to it. The social aspect of the game came too. I mean, your friends would come over, and you could play against them, or you could play on the same team. I played that game to death. To death, I played that game.
Oh, same here. I never had 94 because 94 in the Genesis is probably one of the best hockey games ever made.
Period.
Still to this day. I mean, and you can say top 5 sports game ever made.
It's a classic.
And I popped that in. I'll tell you a quick story. I have NHL 94, the Genesis version. Now, growing up, I never had a Genesis. I was Team Nintendo. God save me if I had a Sega anything in my home. Anything. I had EGMs and Game Pros that had Sega advertisements. That's the closest it got to any of that. So I never had it. So I had NHL 96, I think it was, for my Super Nintendo.
That's another great game.
Which are good, but for something about 94 hits a sweet spot that no other hockey game's ever done. And I play it once in a while. I have an emulator, and I play it. Actually, last time I was on stream on my Twitch channel, I streamed an hour of playing NHL 94. And it was fun. It's amazing. So fun. I think it has something to do with the balance. It's a very balanced game.
The engine, right. You're right. Yeah. The mechanics of... I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that the NHL 96, for example, you could do like a spinorama or something, I think.
Yep.
You didn't have that on the NHL 94. Nope. So it really was a battle of skill. The speed of it is tuned properly to what I think a real NHL game would be. And all the other iterations started moving one way or the other. And when it deviated from that central point of just near perfection that NHL 94 is, and the Genesis version, not the SNES, the Genesis version in particular is that sweet spot. I think it just started deviating and it became like an isotope, right? It kind of just degraded. Mm-hmm. With every iteration a bit.
Yeah,
so
that's correct. It got less and less, I guess, real is the point. It was smooth skating in the 96, 97, 99 games, but it didn't feel as real. With 94 was, you said it best. It was a perfect balance of mechanics and engineering. The game felt real. The game felt, it's obviously 16 bits, but it felt real. It felt like you were watching a real game.
And it's interesting too, because I feel like, and again, this is just me playing it recently, the weight of the players feels right too. Like when you land a check, it feels good.
Yes.
The kinesthetic, the sound is good. Do you remember in NHL 94, there is they have the intro to the games will have Ron Barr from EA Sports, Ron Barr, and it gives you a little thing on how loud the arena is, and this player is on a cold streak, this player's on a hot streak, and that stuff mattered. Like in the game, it was, of
course,
it was great. And as fans of the New Jersey Devils, there was no Brodeur.
There was no Terraria or Billington. Yeah, that's right.
That's it, Terraria and Billington.
I put Billington in always. I know Terraria had the better overall rating, but I always thought that Billington, his rebounds were always to the outside. Terraria gave up these juicy rebounds, so I always put Billington in over Terraria.
Rebound control, very, very important in NHL 94. never-ending battle between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. It was always which version is better, which version of this game is better on whichever console. And NHL 94 was one of the few that you really couldn't argue in favor of Nintendo. Next up, Greg Sewart from Player One Podcast, and then Ryan, also known as RGB High Score on Twitter, tell us exactly why that's the case. I mean, well, Genesis, NHL 94, of course, is still, I think, probably a top 5 sports game ever made. I mean, I'm not trying to. I mean, it's just incredible. I'm a hockey fan too, so for me, we played. I had never had a Genesis. Everything I had was SNES, and I believe I had it for the Super Nintendo, and I'm sure I would have been made fun of for it. Yeah, boo. Yeah, man, but it's definitely a classic. It's amazing. I can't get through a Genesis conversation without someone bringing up NHL 94, and even people who aren't hockey fans.
It's such a great game.
Yeah.
It's I mean, there was something about that. Like, I actually was playing the original NHL hockey for a freelance gig that I'm working on the other day, and I hadn't played it in a while, and sort of remembering back, like, it was so different from, basically up to that point, it was ice hockey and Blades of Steel for me and my friends, which were great games.
Yeah.
But this felt like a real hockey game, So, plus it had the real teams, which didn't hurt.
Yeah, which is nice, and players. So it definitely was pretty cool for the time. It also has the game has a weight to it. I think if that makes any sense. Like the players feel like they have a weight when they hit. They hit. I think a lot of the newer ones, they were getting too fast and light, so you didn't get that sense of just.
I literally wrote that in the freelance work that I was doing. It was exactly that. It's like these players had momentum. It wasn't like Blades of Steel when you stopped pushing a direction, your player stopped.
I've been playing it. I've been playing it relatively recently. My daughter, she's 1 now, but when she was first born, as I was waiting to do the 12:30 at night feeding, I'd pull out the 3DS, I have the emulator on there, and start playing some NHL 94. And
nice.
It still holds up, man. It's a great game. But yeah, NHL 94, why is that game so good? And why is it one of the greatest, maybe the greatest sports game ever made?
So the first question I'll have for you is, what platform do you prefer to play it on, Genesis or Super Nintendo?
I grew up with the Super Nintendo version, but the Genesis is I think a little better.
Far superior, I'd agree.
Yeah.
I would. It's one of the few where you do the Pepsi challenge between Genesis and Super Nintendo, and that's one of the ones that I think sticks out the best.
Oh yeah, no, for sure, yeah.
Right. So the customizable portion of it, the fluidity of the passing, in just the gameplay as far as injuries and things that come up, it was such a jump forward from any other hockey game that you played as a kid. And honestly, I think that they tried to recapture that formula, but by adding a little bit too much in 95 and then every iteration after that, where it's just simple enough to be good, but has enough play elements to make it interesting.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think it feels so good. Like even like hits feel good.
Oh yeah.
As they moved forward, they started tacking things on, and it was kind of like subtraction by addition.
Right.
You know what I mean? It just you add up the spinorama. It's like, well, didn't need a spinorama because that kind of breaks the physics, right? It kind of breaks goaltending, and they add these different physics, different types of hits and such, which breaks this thing, which means you have more exploits. And I think 94 it's like you said, it's a beautiful balance. It's such a balanced, fun game that anybody can literally pick up and start dunking away and playing well. So, man, is that a classic? So, but if you play as the Devils, you're at a disadvantage because they are bad. They are.
Which is funny because
pre-Brodeur.
Yeah, 95 they would have been the best team.
Yeah, exactly. It was pre-Brodeur. It was,
and then the Rangers, of course, are probably the best team.
Yeah, I think they're up there. Yeah, so.
That sucks.
Good old answer 94. And finally, before we move on with the rest of the episode, and apologies if you're not an NHL 94 fan for the 16 or so minutes of content dedicated to this game. It's just crazy how many people love this game, but it's amazing, so I don't blame them. Before we move on with the rest of the episode, one more clip from Brian, also known as Since Spacies on Twitter. He tells us how he got the NHL 94 bug, even though he lives 1,000 miles away from hockey in general. Did you have any games that you were obsessed with?
NHL.
NHL 94?
All of them.
Okay, cool. Are you a hockey guy or?
I was because of that game.
Okay, cool.
So you grow up in Australia. Ice hockey's not exactly something you're exposed to much in your life. And I remember being kind of mildly interested in this new EA hockey that just came out. Got a pirated version of that. whack that in. And I remember, like, for a game to get played a lot in my household, it had to be good because I had a shoebox, which I've still got to this day. I've got 2 shoebox filled with discs for Mega Drive games. And so if you wanted time in my Mega Drive, you had to be a good game.
Yeah. Right.
And I put in EA Hockey. Very small game, by the way, the original one. It's like 4 megs, which is ridiculously tiny.
Yeah.
And it was just addictive, just stupidly addictive, being able to play. The thing that I used to say about it was that you could play 100 different games of this EA. You could play it 100 times and no 2 games will be the same.
Sure.
And that's one thing that I loved about it was the randomness of like, you don't know if you shoot, if it's going to go in or if a fight's going to start just before the goal goes in and all this nonsense that was in the game. and that exposed me to the world of ice hockey. I ended up becoming a Pittsburgh Penguins fan. Sorry if you're not a fan, but that was my team. And I had nothing else to base it on except the logo. I just liked their logo. That was it.
Well, Lemieux was on the team, so of course you were.
I didn't know who Mario Lemex was. I didn't even know how to pronounce his name.
Oh, that's funny. I loved NHL, and I played it on the SNES. But so I grew up watching and playing hockey, so hockey is like a big deal for me. So that's really fun to hear that story.
Well, it has been a big deal for me since the early '90s. So I think I've earned my stripes as a hockey fan, but it is hard to get to watch the games here unless you've got the NHL pass. So that's the only way you can. I mean, we live in good times now where that stuff is available to you. But back in the '90s, we got 2 games a week, and they were just random games. You didn't know what you were going to get on TV.
Games, and more games after this commercial break.
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free. What Nintendo?
To start us off on the games conversation, Greg Sewart shares some of the titles he fell in love with on the Sega Genesis. And again, it's not Sonic. We talk a bit about it, and there'll be an entire episode dedicated to the Hedgehog. Don't worry, that's a-coming. For now, Greg shares some of the titles he fell in love with on the Genesis. Cool. What other titles from the Genesis really kind of resonated with you back in those days, or even now? You know,
Streets of Rage 2 is right up there. Streets of Rage, obviously, and actually when you're talking about sort of Super Nintendo versus Genesis, that was sort of another touchstone moment where, because right around the same time Final Fight came out on the Super Nintendo, Genesis owners were getting Streets of Rage, and Streets of Rage didn't look as nice, but oh my god, did it play better. You know, I mean, it just was so much better than Final Fight. I mean, Final Fight felt kind of rickety and old by the time it came out. Plus, it was only single player. Whereas, you know, I remember magazine spreads. I want to say EGM and GameFan at least did this, where I think it was EGM where they had just like almost a film stock style set of pictures showing all the moves one of the characters would have. And it's like, you know, you have the punches and the kicks and the jumps and the jump kicks and the knees and the, you know, you can grab them and you can flip over them and suplex. Like, it's just all stuff you couldn't do on Final Fight. So a big fan of that. And then Streets of Rage 2 came out, and I've marked that as my favorite game of all time, multiple times.
Really? Interesting.
That's one of my fondest memories of the 16-bit era, actually, was another lifelong friend of mine now. He worked at one of these gaming stores that rented Genesis games. And it was nearby where my family kept the race car that we had. So I would go with my dad on like a Saturday to help him work on the race car. And then this store called Game World was down the street. And then when I was done sort of helping him, I'd take off and go hang out at Game World and just chat about games with the guy who worked there, Jim, and just, play demos and stuff like that. And then usually would go back to his place and hang out with him, like grab dinner, play games and all that sort of thing. And we had this stupid thing that we would do where if Streets of Rage 2 wasn't rented, he could take home whatever he wanted if he was working the next morning, right? So if it hadn't been rented that night, he would just check and see before we left, and he'd look at me and go, "You want to rage?" I was like, "Absolutely." So we'd take Streets of Rage 2 home, awesome. And we would, we played it so much, we'd like crank it up to the hardest difficulty and just blast
rage
through it with exactly with the like the stereo pumping and everything, and it was just amazing. So definitely one of the main ones that sort of resonated with me on the Genesis for sure. The first Sonic the Hedgehog, actually not a big Sonic 2 fan. I stayed with the one that brung me. So the first Sonic has remained a real favorite of mine as well. And then I kind of love discovering stuff that you couldn't play on other systems, like Alicia Dragoon is right up there for me as well, which was a Sega game from Game Arts. It's basically a remake of Thexter, but with like a fantasy setting. And The Immortal on the Genesis from EA, Road Rash. Like a lot of that stuff that felt like Genesis games, although The Immortal was on the NES as well, but not as gory as this one was. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. Not to digress too much, but the fact that you say we used to go home to where they kept the race car in the garage, that's kind of the coolest sentence I think anybody could say. That is pretty darn cool, especially as a kid. Hey, you want to go play some Streets of Rage 2, and then we'll check out the race car?
Yeah.
And then we have like this artillery section with like just really cool like, what else could there possibly be? I find it interesting that you rate, personally, this might be a personal thing, Sonic 1 over Sonic 2. Is that more of like as a personal thing, or is that more of like an objective? Yes, I think this game is a better game than Sonic 2.
No, I think objectively, like if I was put on my reviewer hat, I would definitely say Sonic 2 was a better game.
Right.
It just, it had much more time. It was much more refined. And had some neat gimmicks in it as well. And of course you had 2-player if you wanted it and that sort of thing. But it's just the first Sonic, I remember the first time I played the first Sonic, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. And it's again, one of those, it's almost like comfort food now, where I can just pick that game up at any time and play through it and fully enjoy it. And of course, games back then were generally not that long, so you can play through it in like 20 minutes or so. And I just Sonic 2 never clicked that way for me. I don't know if I was interested in different kinds of games at the time. But Sonic 2 just never really clicked for me like Sonic 1 did. Yeah,
because everyone I talk to, and the next question I'm going to ask, the answer has always been Sonic 2 for most people I've asked it to. If you had to pick a game that really, so let's say someone like me, for example, who never played the Genesis as a kid, I think I've beaten Streets of Rage 2 in my life. I think that's about it. Like I just have very little experience with it. If you had somebody who had never played Genesis before, and you want to kind of share with them one game they should try first, like here's why this is a great system, this is why I fell in love with it, other than Streets of Rage 2 or the first two Sonics, because we kind of already talked about that, what would you recommend?
Easily Gunstar Heroes.
Oh, that's great. That is good. Yes.
That's just, because I mean that game had going for it sort of the speed and the action that Sega always advertised it had over the Super Nintendo. You know what I mean? Like, it's just a fast-paced game. There's so much going on at all times, but there's also some great sort of graphical tricks in it. Everything moves super fast. So it's just, and it's 2-player on top of everything else. So, that has definitely always been a showpiece for me. That's one of the go-tos for the Genesis.
That's an excellent pick. I always forget about Gunstar, but man, again, as an SNES kid, I think I would have looked at that and said, yeah, it's pretty awesome. Anyway, back to some fun stuff, baby. We talked a bit about the Genesis, and obviously you're a huge Genesis fan with your series that you're doing. Mm-hmm. Are you doing like every game? Is that kind of the goal?
That's the goal. I'm doing it myself, and kind of like what you said. I mean, I'm a single parent. I've got 3 kids. And, primary parent. So I'm pretty busy, full-time job otherwise. Wow. The hope is to cover every game. I don't know that that's ever going to happen. I've just basically finished 1990. The most recent episode was the final game of 1990. So, I mean, it only gets more intense from there on. And when I started the series, it was 5 games an episode, and it was like 5 minutes each, a quick review. But then being sort of a history buff, as well as a big game nerd, things started to balloon, and the episodes started getting longer and longer and longer. And now it's like most recently I released an episode that was 30 minutes on Sword of Sodan.
I saw that.
This little nothing game, right? So, but so much interesting history behind it. So,
sure.
Yeah, I doubt I'll ever get through the whole library. I hope that I do. I mean, someday I have to retire, and I'm going to need something to do to pass the time. So,
sure.
Maybe that'll be the thing. But that's the goal. I don't think I'll ever reach it, but that is the goal.
That's cool. Very cool. Were there any other Genesis games that maybe some under the radar titles that you think people just really ought to try that just kind of doesn't come up on a lot of people doesn't come up on a lot of people's radars?
Yeah, well, I mentioned one a little bit earlier. There was a game called Alicia Dragoon, which actually did end up on the Genesis Mini, and I was so happy to see it. And of course, I'm not talking about Sega CD stuff or anything either, which I'm a huge fan of that system as well. But like Game Arts, if you were a Sega CD fan, you ever played the Lunar games? Those were made by Game Arts, and this game Alicia Dragoon, I couldn't believe at the time that Sega even released it in the US or Canada, because it's not based on it's not licensed. As far as I know, it's not licensed. They partnered with an anime studio called Gainax, which if you're an anime fan, you know that name. I honestly don't know that name very well, but I've been told that they were important. And basically just made this completely original side-scrolling platformer where you're playing as I don't even know how to describe her, like a sorceress, I guess. And it just really, there's something about it. It's a beautiful game. Like, it has great music. It has gorgeous graphics. It's completely original, but it's just extremely polished. And it didn't even hit me until recently that it's kind of like a remake of Game Art's original game, which was called Thexter, that was actually brought here by Sierra Online way back in the day. And in that game, you're just playing as this robot, but the interesting thing about it could transform, which Alicia Dragoon can't do. But it had a laser that I think you press spacebar to shoot the laser, and it was a homing laser. So it was like this laser that would just shoot out at everything on the screen that it could hit at once. Like, it would just alternate between all the targets. And that's how Alicia Dragoon plays. When you press the attack button, it's a stream of like electricity or lightning that comes out of her hands, and it homes in on whatever's available to hit on the screen. And like I said, it didn't hit me until recently that it literally is just a remake of Thexter in a lot of ways.
Okay.
So that one comes to mind pretty quickly. Just trying to think some other ones. I'm actually looking through my Genesis collection here. I would say also, I don't know if people talk about this one as much, but it also came on the Super Nintendo, called Flashback.
I don't know that one.
Okay, so Flashback is... did you ever play Out of This World?
Yeah, I played a bit of it. I have to play it again. I played some of it, yeah.
So Flashback is kind of... It's similar to Out of This World in that it's, again, a side-scrolling game, but it's all... I believe it's all rotoscoped animation. And it's literally just this... It's kind of like an Invasion of the Body Snatchers kind of story, but it plays kind of mostly like Prince of Persia, actually. But in this like really cool sci-fi setting. It was done by this French software company called Delphine Software. And it's just, again, it's a fantastic game that I would actually envy anyone to pick it up and play it for the first time, having never experienced it before and not knowing what to expect. because it really grabs you, and it's just super well made. But you are basically playing Prince of Persia in a sci-fi sort of invasion of the body snatchers
That sounds
setting.
cool.
Yeah, a lot of shooting as well, so it's really nice. And
Very cool.
one other one I would say real quick, and this is a little bit older, and again, it might seem really weird, but Ghostbusters for the Genesis, I would highly recommend.
Okay.
So if anyone's ever played Ghostbusters for like the Commodore 64, the David Crane version, Commodore 64, I think a version came out on the NES as well. It's not great. It's not a very good game. And it was just, the reason I bring it up is because I just saw it pop up on my screen here, and it was also one of the earliest games that I rented for my Genesis. And, you know, it's Ghostbusters, and Ghostbusters for people our age was huge. You know, it was a massive hit. Everybody had seen Ghostbusters. So I always kind of wanted to try these games, and I knew that this one was a little bit different from the Activision game that David Crane had done. Although you do see, when you start the game, you see a trademark for Activision on there, so they're still involved somehow, I think, just for the license. But it's an action platformer. It's a shooter, basically, where you play as a caricature of Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, or Harold Ramis. And it's just sort of a very early 16-bit Sega platforming shooter that happens to be themed to Ghostbusters. And it's
interesting,
fantastic. And it's like a pre-Sonic game. So I find when I'm making recommendations for Genesis games that people don't know about, I kind of either go deep into the end of the library, because that's when, you know, places like Konami and Treasure were just doing amazing things with the system, but also like to look at sort of pre-1991, because most people, if they were into the Genesis back in the 90s, got into it because of Sonic.
Right. That's interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So anything that came out before that is kind of obscure. And Ghostbusters is one of those. Like, same thing with like Moonwalker and Castle of Illusion and the earlier Phantasy Stars. Like, you know, those all came out before Sonic the Hedgehog. So they're all sort of worth going back and taking a look at.
Very cool. Those are interesting picks. I'm definitely want to try it. Was it Flashback? Was that the one? Or
highly recommend that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna try that. That sounds really fun. That sounds really cool. Kind of up my alley there. In the next block of interviews, Michael K. Hughes from the Games My Mom Found podcast tells us about how he acquired Sonic 3 and some of the adorable mom pranks that his mom used to play on him. It's a really cute story. And after him, Ryan returns to talk about some of the Genesis games he fell in love with. And after that, Andrew tells us some stories of a game where you can literally kill the ref. Let's join the conversation. What were some of your obsessive games for Genesis?
For the Genesis, Sonic 3 was a big one. That was another one I got for a birthday. I remember my mom's like, "Can you go pick up the blanket off the living room floor?" And I went in there, and Sonic 3 was like sitting on top of it just before school, which is the worst time to give a kid a new game, because like,
what?
Yeah,
you can't do that.
Have fun at school for 8 hours, then you can come home and play it.
No, yeah, he's gonna see, as if you're paying attention to anything anybody is saying. The school could be on fire. You're sitting there. I got myself Sonic 3's at home. Sonic 3.
Oh, she loved to do those surprise things, because there was another day where she called me from work, and she had me go into the kitchen and open a drawer, and there's like the new Nintendo Power issue.
That's so cool.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, how fun.
Which was the Game Boy Donkey Kong game, to bring it back to that. It was on the cover.
Go. Very good.
Yeah. She's the best.
Oh, that's awesome, man. Very cool. And so I didn't own anything Sega. Never. I've played maybe 5 Sega games in my life to this point, and I'm not in the war anymore, mind you. I don't care what you play, but it's just I just don't have the experience with it. So it's very interesting when I hear about.
Really struggling to remember what we used to play for, because like I know I had garbage like Bubba and Sticks, which is this really crappy platformer. It's real bad. I tried to play it recently. Like, maybe I was just a dumb kid. Like, no, it still sucks. Had Bubsy 2. I didn't have Bubsy 1. That was the one that I played at a friend's house.
Speaking of the Bit Wars, you were Team Nintendo? Did you have any Genesis or anything like that?
As a kid, I was definitely Team Nintendo. Of course, having a Sega Game Gear definitely opened my eyes to the possibility that Sega wasn't so bad as I originally Probably told all my friends.
Yep.
But getting into it, this is, again, as an adult, got into collecting for the Genesis, and I love it. I think it's fantastic. As you pointed out, Streets of Rage 2, even though I didn't play it as a kid, it is a wonderful, wonderful beat 'em up.
It's fantastic.
Right. And there's a lot of really great, just platforming games on the system that really shine. I actually, Phantasy Star 4 is really, really good on it as well. So it itches all of the necessary spots, if you will, when it comes to my desire, especially when it comes to gaming. So
that's cool. That's very cool. I always go back to Gunstar Heroes when it comes to Genesis game. That is prized even as an adult, because again, I've not played a lot of Genesis even to this day. But that was one that keeps coming up in those best of lists. I'm like, you know what? That just sounds like a blast. And oh man, that game! If you haven't played Gunstar Heroes, you're honestly missing out. It's such a fun experience, just kinetic and customizing and all of that. Just really great action gameplay. It's really just a phenomenal treat.
And just the fact that it consistently changes the atmosphere and what you're playing on, and then it's got like a mini board game towards the end of it, which is. Again, to your point, it's random, so I don't know if it's going, if it's going to work out in my favor. Right. So having to roll a dice to figure out where you're going to land on that board, I thought was an amazing game element. And we were doing RGB high score for that too. So one of the things is that you're watching people stream this online. And the funny part is that they want the highest score, so they're actually rooting against themselves from getting the easiest path for them.
Oh, yeah, sure. So
that was just an extra special experience for that game in particular.
No, that's a very interesting point. Yeah, if you're going for high scores, do not shoot for that easy one. Just an incredible game. Really, really a fun experience. Anyway, yeah, so Genesis, what games were you, obviously Sonic was probably one of your first loves.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think you could have been a Sega kid in that period without Sonic being like your first argument for it.
Sure.
But weirdly, that was not my favorite game. The game that I probably got the most joy out of playing on the Sega Genesis that didn't exist on the SNES was Mutant League Football.
I remember Mutant League Football. I played that at my friend Joey's house. I think he had that, and there was hockey too, if I'm not mistaken.
There was, but it wasn't made with the same kind of love.
Okay.
It felt like the game where Mutant League Football was a quiet success, and the designer was told, you have 3 months to make something else.
Oh boy, gotcha.
And so it's not an awful game. It just doesn't have in Mutant League Football. So much of the joy is that every decision you make, there's a joke there. Every choice on the screen is a gag or a gory mess. Everything you do has some fun outcome. The fact that you can literally, one of the audibles that you can call before you hike the ball is bribing the ref.
Get out of here. That's cool.
and another audible that you can call is to kill the ref.
Oh, even better. I mean, if you can't bribe him, kill him.
So you bribe him, and every play, regardless of what you get, the ref calls against the other team to give you an extra 10 yards.
That's funny.
And after about 2 or 3 times of that, even the computer would decide it was time to kill the ref. just to wipe the slate clean, so there was no more bribed ref.
Oh, that's funny.
Ruling in your favor.
That's funny. It understood what was going on. After a while, I was like, all right, this is getting ridiculous. Take him down.
Yeah, well, and the fact that you could, tackle people into mines so that they would explode and push people off the edge into space. And
lovely.
It was just such a bizarre series.
That's strange. It's very good, though. Very, very good. Anything else that stood out in those early Genesis years or even later in the cycle?
Most of the stuff is stuff that is very contentious for people, like Disney's Aladdin.
Oh, yeah.
Which, even though I now, in hindsight, much prefer the Super Nintendo as a series, the Sega Genesis version of Aladdin is way, way better. It is a far superior game.
I've played it on Genesis. I think I actually relatively recently did both, and I agree. I think I enjoyed the Genesis more because I know that can definitely be contentious.
Yeah, well, the Genesis had the advantage of having Disney artists not draw the sprites, but draw animations that were used to draw the sprites.
Okay.
So the movement in the game feels like the animation of the movie. Soundtrack's great. It follows the narrative plot of the film, where the Super Nintendo is a little too pastel. The colors are much more pastel and bright and friendly. Where the Sega Genesis, if you're in the Cave of Wonders, it's dark in there.
Right.
And the Super Nintendo version also veered sort of off the narrative of the film and focused on being inside the lamp and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
I'm a very literal person. I really love a game that sticks to the story.
Yeah, that one-to-one kind of correlation really, really connects with you. That's interesting. Yeah, very cool. Yeah, the Aladdin. What other ones that you thought you're going to be a little contentious?
Rocket Knight Adventure.
I don't know it. I don't know it at all.
You were essentially, I guess he's a possum, I think.
Okay.
And he's a possum wearing sort of knight's armor with a sword and a jetpack.
Nice. Okay.
And so it was this really interesting platformer that was all about sort of building and controlling your momentum.
Ooh, okay. That's cool.
So, you're standing still and there are enemies up there, and you sort of direct yourself in the same direction as the enemies and charge your jetpack and then launch off and blast through them with your sword out in front of you and take out all the enemies at once. Or you could move really slowly and just jump up and hit them.
Interesting. Kind of like that risk reward of moving forward, being fast or taking your time. Kind of, yeah, like that risk reward almost. Huh. That sounds interesting.
Well, it felt a lot like Mega Man with a jetpack.
Sounds awesome.
it had a lot of personality. It was really fun to look at. Which brings up another one, Earthworm Jim.
Oh, sure.
Was like a game changer for me.
That's a great game.
I'm sure you've noticed over the course of the conversation, I'm a big fan of animation.
Yes.
I love good animation, and Earthworm Jim was just, ooh.
Yeah, expressive is what
beautiful.
Really expressive animation.
Yeah, expressive, beautiful, and just weird, offbeat, funny. I remember finding that game about the same time I found the band They Might Be Giants.
Oh, yeah.
And they both sort of scratched the same itch of being just a little clever and a little strange and a little out of their time.
Yep. That's actually a really good, that's a really good kind of connection there for sure. Yeah, Earthworm Jim was always just a bizarre little game. And it's a game where it shouldn't work, but it does. Like, Earthworm in a spacesuit, wisecracking around, going on his little adventures.
But it's that sort of weirdness that when you're that age, because if I remember correctly, I was in junior high when that game came out, because that would have been 94, if I had to guess.
Sounds about right. Yeah. 94.
And when you're that age, like, that kind of weirdness just strikes you as being so clever.
And also,
like, it's irreverent and strange and
just a weird, goofy game that plays well. It feels pretty good in your hands. And again, it's been forever since I've run through Earthworm Jim. I now need to kind of dig one up and see if I can run through it again. But
prepare yourself for that. That's a tough game to go back to.
Oh, is it? Oh no, see,
just mostly from the perspective of the game never holds your hand. It gets weird for the sake of weird, which is great. That's everything that makes it fun. But to suddenly, in like Earthworm Jim, there's a level where you're suddenly just a salamander.
That's right.
And there's the level in the first one where you are in the little submarine thing and on a timer, and that timer is impossibly tight.
Yep. Oh gosh, that's right. Okay.
And bungee jumping with the snot guy.
Hey, listen, it was the mid-90s. You had to have some sort of booger in there somewhere. And finally, to round out the episode, Brian returns to share some of the strange titles that he fell in love with as a kid. And Ian, also known as TB or Teacher Bloke 85 on Twitter, shares his connection to this system as an adult collecting for the first time.
I used to be into the obscure Japanese stuff like Magical Flying Hat Turbo Adventure.
What is that?
I'm surprised I can even remember the name.
Wow.
You might know it as Decapitac.
No, I don't even know what is that.
Okay. Well, it was originally released as Magical Flying Hat Turbo Adventure in Japan, and then they rebranded it as just simply Decapitac, changed all the artwork, everything, the music, the lot, but the game itself was the same. There was games like that, it was a platformer. I'm just trying to think of memory or the other games that we would get stuck into. John Madden, again with the sport games, which again the Mega Drive or Genesis was the system for sport games.
Yes, yes, it was.
And I think that's why they appealed more to the college kids at the time, the university kids at the time, because they just had the more adult approach to games. I mean, you look at the whole Mortal Kombat saga. You don't have to go into that too much. We all know what happened there.
Exactly.
If you wanted the blood, you get it. You got to get a Genesis, or you got to get a Mega Drive. Yeah,
that was it. That was literally it. So that was a big crusher for against Nintendo, right? They having the more being aware and actually being ahead of the time, realizing that adults were playing this thing too. It wasn't just a toy for kids. There were people out there who could handle mature themes. And let's be honest, if you're a kid, watching someone's head come off is pretty awesome. It's pretty cool. I mean, it's fun.
The first game we got to see, which featured just stupid gore graphics like that, was The Immortal. It was released on the Mega Drive. It was an EA game, and they had fatalities in it where you would get the final blow against a demon or whatever, and you would see either his guts explode or he'd be sliced down the middle. That was my favorite one because it was just like, holy crap, what are we watching here? And that was before Mortal Kombat. And then we would actually at the hotline go down to the local shops to play Mortal Kombat on the arcade cabinet during lunch break, and then come back and answer calls on Alex Kidd.
All wholesome. You're downstairs watching Scorpion throw a spear through somebody, and then he'd come upstairs. Yeah, so the adorable Alex Kidd, third level. That's funny. Very good.
And then change gears to get over here.
Absolutely, man. That's really cool. So, and did you ever get a Mega Drive?
Yeah, I got one a few years ago.
Oh, that's right. You did. So how do you feel about it? You didn't have it at the time, but you now have it as an adult. How do you feel about that console, and where do you kind of feel like it fit in during that era now that you're looking at it with kind of more adult eyes?
Yeah, do you know what? I absolutely love it. I think it's a great machine. I think the sound that comes out of it is just so pleasantly chunky. As opposed to kind of the orchestration that you get from the Super Nintendo, the junk, 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 junk on this thing. It's fantastic. I've only got an armful of games for the Mega Drive, but the ones I've got are ones that I played at my friends' houses when I was younger, such as Pugsy, I mentioned earlier, Echo the Dolphin, and some that I was kind of envious that I couldn't play on the Super Nintendo, things like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade I can see on my shelf. It's an okay game, but as a fan of the movie, I had to have a copy of the game.
Right.
And I literally just a couple of weeks back picked up Phantasy Star 4, which a lot of people tell me I must play, but I haven't started it yet.
Okay.
It, again, starved for RPGs over here. It seems that we did get Phantasy Star 4.
Neat. I hear nothing but good things about that. Yeah, I've never played it, but I hear it's great. Yeah. If you were to talk to somebody like me who's really never played a Genesis game or I've completed Streets of Rage 2, but other than that, I don't think I've ever completed a Genesis game.
Yeah.
Which would be the one you would tell them to start with?
Sonic 2.
Yeah.
It's one that I played many, many years ago, my stepbrother had a Mega Drive growing up, and when I used to go over to my dad's house on weekends, he used to show me all these games and say, "Oh, look at this! Look at, Echo the Dolphin. Look at Sonic 2." I remember he had Sonic 2 because he had to go out one day, and he said, "Oh yeah, play Sonic 2 to your heart's content. Of course you can." And I sat down and almost beat it in a couple of sittings. Loved it though. Absolutely fantastic game.
Yeah, Sonic 2 seems like it's a lot of people's answer to that question. Yeah. Again, I played the first Sonic again as an adult. I got maybe halfway through the first world. I'm like, I don't know about this. I always feel like it's Sonic. I never have enough time to make a good decision.
Yeah.
Like with platforming. And I think I've been. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say the first time I played Sonic was on the Sonic Collection on the GameCube.
Oh yeah.
And I'm told that that's not a particularly good version. But it seemed fine to me. But I don't know. Maybe it's just missing some of the nostalgic value that the Mega Drive version of it had.
Perhaps. I just feel like I've always felt like it wants you to go fast, but when I go super fast, I'm just going on the ride. I feel like control has been removed from my body. Yeah. And I'm just now hurtling through space and then into a spike. And I've been told, like, no, you actually should play it like a platformer. Like, play it carefully and thoughtfully and approach the challenges. It's a lot more fun that way. I have Sonic 2 somewhere on an emulator, an evil emulator somewhere.
There's nothing evil about emulators. It's how I play Chrono Trigger.
Yeah, see, there you go. I have it somewhere, so I might have to give it a go and give it a try.
I think aside from that, the other one that I do remember quite clearly was my stepbrother had a copy of Lost Vikings.
Ooh, that's a good game.
Yeah, and
it's a good game.
Yeah, I had it on the Super Nintendo, and I remember going over one weekend and him saying, "I'm really stuck on this level. You finished it, haven't you?" Yeah. "Oh, can you help me on this level?" "Yeah, sure. Which one is it?" And he takes me through, and I'm looking at it. I don't know this level.
Ooh.
I felt like Gandalf. I have no knowledge of this place. But apparently it's because the Mega Drive version came out after the Super Nintendo version and they put in some extra levels.
Ooh, wow. Yeah, that's cool. I like when that happens, but it
makes
tough.
The Mega Drive version, well, your definitive version of Lost Vikings, I guess. I remember puzzling through that level with him for an afternoon, thinking, well, how do you do that? I don't know this level, I'm scared.
It's unfamiliar and scary.
Yeah. I thought it was going to be a breeze where I could show off and like, oh yeah, you do this, you do it. Nope.
A very special thank you to all of my guests who joined me on this retrospective of the Sega Genesis, and thank you for listening all the way to the end. You didn't have to, yet you did, and I greatly appreciate it. If you haven't done so already, do all the podcaster things. Follow me on Twitter at @GamerLooksAt40. Like, subscribe, rate, and review on all the platforms you can get your greedy hands on. All of that really helps move the show forward and expose it to a larger audience. And as I say all the time, more audience means more guests, means more stories, means more good stuff to share with you. As always, thanks again for listening. Continue being awesome.